Welcome back to the deep dive. We are really thrilled you are sitting down with us today because, honestly, we have a truly fascinating mission ahead of us.
We really do. It is quite the stack of materials we have on the table today.
It really is.
Yeah.
Today we are opening up a collection of sources that basically forces this massive collision between breaking geopolitical news and ancient biblical prophecy.
Yeah, it is not every day you get to examine modern military headlines placed right alongside ancient scriptures.
Exactly. But that is exactly the landscape we are navigating today.
And what we have on the table are breaking international news reports. These are from early March 2026.
Right.
And they are paired directly with a series of theological essays and some pretty detailed sermon notes.
Which is such an interesting combination.
It is. The person who authored these notes is attempting to make spiritual sense of the massive, chaotic, modern conflicts we are seeing, but they are doing it by looking backward.
Like thousands of years backward.
Thousands of years, if you can visualize, say, an intense, high-tech, modern news desk,
Yeah.
right? And then that slowly fades into a backdrop of ancient, dusty parchment. That is the exact thematic space we are occupying today.
I really love that visual.
It is a powerful example of how human beings constantly look to the distant past to try and find an anchor in a really turbulent present.
Absolutely. But before we get into the weeds of these texts, we need to pause and make something explicitly clear to you, our listener.
Yes, this is a vital distinction to establish up front.
Right. Our goal today is strictly to impartially explore the texts provided in this stack. We are not taking any political sides regarding the Middle East.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing any specific military actions, nor are we endorsing the specific theological or religious viewpoints presented in these sermons.
Exactly. We are just the guides to the material.
Purely analytical. Our mission is just to map out the fascinating way the author of these sources connects ancient scriptures to today's headlines.
Because the texts we are examining deal with highly charged political, military, and religious themes.
Very charged.
So our role is simply to synthesize the information. We want to show you how the author of these documents is connecting the dots between the Middle East of today and the Middle East of antiquity.
So, with those guardrails firmly in place, let's jump straight into the breaking geopolitical reality that centers our sources.
Let's do it.
As of early March 2026, the news reports in our stack are confirming a massive historical shift. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, has been killed in a joint United States-Israel military strike.
And we really need to pause and look at the sheer scale of that event in world history.
It is monumental.
To give you the specific context laid out in these briefings, Khamenei was the longest-serving head of state in the Middle East at the time of his death.
Which is wild to think about.
We are talking about a man who held absolute final authority. He maintained what the text literally calls an iron rule over the Islamic Republic for nearly 37 years.
37 years.
Right. He took on the role of supreme leader on June 4th, 1989. That was right after the death of Ruhollah Khomeini.
And even before that, he served as Iran's president from 1981 to 1989.
Exactly. So his sudden death doesn't just make headlines. It creates a geopolitical power vacuum of historic proportions.
Yeah, that is a massive sudden absence of power.
And on the other side of this conflict is Benjamin Netanyahu, who the sources note is Israel's longest-serving prime minister.
Right. His tenure is also historically significant.
Yeah.
He has held office for over 15 years combined.
Which is incredible longevity in that political system.
It really is. I mean, he first took office way back in 1996 after defeating Shimon Peres. Then he had a 12-year consecutive run from 2009 to 2021.
And he is currently in his 6th term.
Yes, which began in December 2022. So you have these two massive, entrenched historical figures colliding in this March 2026 moment.
Exactly. And the conflict is actively escalating across the entire region. Look at how Netanyahu is framing this ongoing military campaign.
How so?
He is publicly positioning it as a mission to dismantle elements of Iran's regime and liberate oppressed people. He even issued a direct message to Iranian citizens telling them that help has now arrived. He is essentially framing these joint strikes as support for their internal freedom.
Which brings us to the military theater itself. The specifics outlined in these 2026 reports show a highly volatile regional conflict.
High volatile.
U.S. and Israeli operations against Iran's military infrastructure are ongoing, but it's not a one-sided affair at all.
No, it's not.
The text details that Iran is deploying a very active green water navy, which, just to frame that for our discussion, we aren't talking about a global deep ocean blue water fleet.
Right. But they certainly aren't just hugging their own coastline either. They are projecting serious, localized power.
Okay.
They operate out of major bases like Bandar Abbas, Bushehr, and Chabahar.
Which secures their access right into the Indian Ocean.
Exactly. And they deploy vessels like the destroyer Sahand and the massive support ship Makran.
And the sources point out these aren't just theoretical assets.
Not at all. They have conducted previous missions in the Atlantic, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean.
And this isn't just a political decapitation. It is a massive geographic chess match.
Very much so.
Look at where these naval bases are positioned. The sources point out that Iran controls 7 of the 8 major islands in the Strait of Hormuz.
Which is huge.
Right. For anyone following global trade, you know that is one of the most vital, contested, strategic choke points on the planet.
It is the bottleneck for so much of the world's energy supply.
And the reports mention retaliatory Iranian strikes utilizing missiles and drones on regional U.S. naval facilities.
Specifically targeting installations in Bahrain.
Yes.
What's fascinating here is the sheer scale of the upheaval. We are looking at a fundamental reshaping of power dynamics in a region that has known centuries of prophetic and historical significance.
It is a massive global earthquake.
The physical map is tense, the political map is completely upended, and the global economic implications of a contested Strait of Hormuz are staggering.
Imagine you wake up, you see these headlines, and you feel the weight of this historical shift happening in real time.
It is a lot to process.
It is. And that brings us to the core question driving our deep dive today. How do the theological sources in our stack interpret this massive geopolitical earthquake?
Because the essayist we are reading doesn't just look at this through the lens of modern international relations.
Right, they look backward, way backward.
They do. The author draws a very direct parallel between today's escalating military campaigns and the ancient reign of a biblical king named Jeroboam II.
Okay, let's unpack this. According to the texts, specifically referencing the historical accounts in New Kings 14, Jeroboam II was the sovereign of the northern kingdom of Israel.
Who reigned in Samaria for 41 years.
41 years.
Yeah.
And militarily speaking, he was incredibly successful. He massively expanded Israel's borders.
Massively.
The text notes he restored the border from the entrance of Hamath all the way down to the Sea of the Arabah.
Let's anchor those locations geographically so you can really see the scope of this.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
The entrance of Hamath refers to a strategic pass in the Bekaa Valley in modern-day Lebanon. It leads up to Hamath, which is the ancient city known today as Hama in west-central Syria. It's situated on the banks of the Orontes River, roughly 120 miles north of Damascus.
It is pretty far north.
It is. And then the Sea of the Arabah is the Dead Sea, located at the southern end of the Jordan Rift Valley.
So Jeroboam II didn't just win a few skirmishes.
No, he expanded the nation's territory across a massive geographical footprint. He reclaimed vital trade routes and established immense national prosperity.
But here is the spiritual paradox the author highlights. And honestly, it is the crux of their whole argument.
Yes.
Despite this incredible military success, despite the booming economy and the expanded borders, Scripture explicitly states that Jeroboam II did evil in the sight of the Lord.
He perpetuated the systemic corruption and idolatry of his predecessors.
It's like a modern CEO posting absolute record profits and expanding the company globally, while the internal corporate culture is incredibly toxic and ethically bankrupt.
That is a perfect analogy. The author's key point here is stark. Expansion does not equal righteousness.
Right. Military strength does not equal covenant faithfulness.
And this brings us to a really surprising historical detail in the text.
Yeah, this part threw me a bit.
This massive border restoration under a morally compromised king was actually prophesied to happen.
By Jonah.
Yes.
Jonah. The Nineveh guy. I have to push back on this because that feels completely counterintuitive.
It does seem strange at first glance.
If Jeroboam II is perpetuating this corrupt, toxic culture, why is God sending Jonah to guarantee his military success? What is the essay's angle on that tension?
It is a brilliant tension to point out. The texts give us Jonah's background to help explain this. He was from a place called Gath-hepher.
Okay.
The archaeological and historical notes in our stack identify Gath-hepher as the modern village of Mashhad.
Which is where?
It's located in the lower Galilee, just a couple of miles from Nazareth. Local tradition even holds a shrine there known as Nabi Yunus, the prophet Jonah, which is revered as his tomb.
So you have this prophet from a small Galilean village validating a corrupt king's military campaigns.
Right. Which seems like heaven is endorsing the corrupt king.
Exactly.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the author argues that Jonah's life reveals a profound prophetic pattern.
How so?
We all know Jonah for eventually being sent to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria.
Right, the whole whale story.
Yes. Assyria was Israel's brutal enemy and, historically, their future conqueror.
And Jonah famously didn't want to go.
He didn't want God's mercy extended outward to an enemy nation. But God asks him, "Should I not have compassion on Nineveh?" The tension the author highlights is this: Israel is experiencing temporary military restoration and national pride under Jeroboam II, but God's mercy is already reaching outside Israel's borders.
Oh, wow. So while Israel is celebrating its military dominance and expanding its borders, the divine focus is actually shifting outward toward their enemies.
Exactly. And meanwhile, inside Israel's borders, judgment is quietly looming.
The text points out that God had not yet said he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven during Jeroboam's reign.
Which implies the judgment was only postponed, not canceled.
Right. And historically, within just one generation after this golden age of military expansion, Assyria, the very nation Jonah was sent to, comes down and completely conquers the northern kingdom.
Which brings us to a truly chilling phrase found in another prophetic book from our stack, the book of Hosea.
This part is intense.
As the spiritual corruption in the northern kingdom continues past Jeroboam's reign, God speaks a definitive judgment over them.
And the phrase used in the text is lo ami, which translates to not my people.
God tells the northern kingdom they are cut off.
The covenant nation, the chosen people who held the ancient promise of Abraham, they are cut off. That is brutal language.
It is.
That sounds like a permanent deletion. It sounds like the absolute end of the story for them.
It absolutely sounds like an erasure. To an ancient Israelite hearing that, it meant the loss of national identity, the loss of sovereignty, and being scattered into the wind among foreign nations.
But the theological core of the sermon notes makes a vital distinction here.
Yes, a very important one.
This judgment, this scattering, was not a funeral. It was a planting.
I love how the author frames that. Not a funeral, but a planting.
Because right after that devastating not my people judgment, the very next verse in the text, Hosea 1:10, says something completely radical.
Well, it really is a massive pivot.
It says, in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God.
The author emphasizes that the covenant name was not destroyed. It was transformed and multiplied.
Cut off, scattered, renamed, and restored on a much larger scale.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the sources trace how this exact concept is picked up centuries later by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament.
Right, in the book of Romans.
Yes. If you look at Romans chapters 9 through 11, Paul pulls back the veil on this mystery. He quotes Hosea's exact not my people prophecy, but he applies it to something much broader than just the geographical nation of Israel.
He applies this historical cutting off to a broader mystery, grafting the Gentiles into the promise.
The non-Jewish nations of the world. He uses the famous analogy of an olive tree. Branches are broken off, and new wild branches are grafted in, but they all share one root.
The author of the sermon argues this isn't a story of replacing the original people, but of enlarging the family.
Exactly. The promise to Abraham in Genesis 12:3 says, "In you all families of the earth shall be blessed."
All families.
The sources argue the covenant was never meant to be confined to one geographic border or political state. It was always meant to be global.
It's like tearing down a specific localized building. Not to destroy the company, but to make the blueprint open source for the entire world.
That is a great way to put it.
So what does this all mean when we look at the broad sweep of history?
Well, the text outlines this remarkable, almost rhythmic cycle of transformation. Over millennia, the political structure repeatedly falls apart, but the covenant identity survives and adapts to a new reality.
The text maps it out very clearly. Think about how the name shifts over time.
Right.
It goes from the localized nation of Israel to the southern kingdom of Judah to the identity of the Jews.
It moves from a centralized national kingdom to a surviving remnant after conquest to a scattered diaspora living among the nations.
And eventually, to global expressions of faith that transcend geography entirely.
The political structure changes, but the thread continues.
Which brings us right back to the breaking news from March 2026.
Yes, back to the headlines.
The U.S. and Israeli joint strikes, the sudden death of Ayatollah Khamenei, the ongoing naval battles in the Strait of Hormuz. We have this massive geopolitical earthquake.
And the author of these sources issues a stark warning about how we should interpret current events like this.
The warning is explicit. Do not confuse borders with blessing.
Just as King Jeroboam II expanded Israel's ancient borders while the nation decayed spiritually, the author cautions that when national strength rises under morally compromised leadership today, it might actually precede judgment rather than guarantee divine favor.
The sermon's central message is that the greater Israel is built by faith, not by force.
It isn't built by military campaigns. It isn't built by destroyers patrolling the Indian Ocean or by coordinated high-tech airstrikes. It is formed entirely by faith.
This raises an important question for you, the listener. How does this perspective change the way you consume the news?
That is the real application here.
When you see world leaders and kingdoms rise and fall, when you read about an unprecedented strike killing a supreme leader who held power for 37 years, the author argues that we shouldn't anchor our hope in the rise and fall of presidents, prime ministers, or supreme leaders.
Because God's deeper plan is covenantal, not political.
Modern nations may be instruments of history, kingdoms may fall, but the ancient promise made to Abraham remains completely intact.
It operates on a totally different frequency than the 24-hour news cycle.
We wrap up the journey here, and it is truly mind-bending to see how these sources weave it all together.
It really is.
To take a modern U.S.-Israel military strike in the Middle East and connect it to ancient sites like Mashhad and Hamath, to use the ancient prophet Hosea to interpret the actions of leaders like Khamenei and Netanyahu.
It completely reframes how you look at a headline.
No.
You aren't just reading about a military strike. You are watching a millennial-old pattern play out.
And it leaves us with a profound historical pattern to consider.
Yes. I want to leave you with a final lingering question that builds on all this material.
Okay.
The sources show a historical cycle where the family of faith is repeatedly scattered, transformed, and reborn into entirely new structures over thousands of years.
From a national kingdom to a remnant to a diaspora to global faith expressions.
Exactly. If this pattern of expansion, scattering, and radical transformation is a constant historical cycle, what completely unexpected, unrecognizable form might this covenant family take centuries from now, long after today's modern nations have shifted or faded?
That is a brilliant, lingering cushion to end on. Something for you to really mull over as you watch the news today and see those alerts hit your phone. We want to warmly thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep looking for the deeper patterns beneath the headlines. We will see you next time.